So today's a special day also because it's the 12th to the 12th to the 12th. If you didn't notice that. Next time that's going to happen is in 88 years. So remember this day. It's also a special day because it's Yoav's birthday. All right, so I'm going to talk today a little bit about some of the work we've been doing in the area of accelerating discovery of machines that learn and make discoveries. In particular, machines that can model phenomena and give analytical formula for what's going on, a formula that can then be used to derive models and insight, not just for prediction. But really, the work that we do in our group is focused on robotics, and this is why I put this robot here on the slide. And I won't tell you right away about this machine that makes discoveries. I'll talk first about some of the work we've been doing in robotics, and hopefully you'll see the story of how we got to develop these machines that learn. So most of our work is focused on robotic systems, and as you know, there are millions of robots out there right now, and most of them by far are working in factories, and they're doing the same thing all the time. They're working in structured environments. These robots are superhuman in almost any way you want to measure it. They're fast, they're precise, they're very powerful, they work 24/7, but they have one weakness, and that's their ability to deal with unforeseen situations, to adapt to new things. Now, if you look at biology, biology is exactly the other way around. Biology is not as fast, not as powerful, can't work 24/7, but biology is very adaptive to new situations. So a lot of research, a big frontier in robotics research today is making adaptive machines that can handle unforeseen situations. So that's what we set out to do, and one of our projects earlier, maybe a decade ago, was to try to evolve robots. So we use genetic algorithm type processes, evolutionary algorithms, and this is what we did back in 2000. We threw in lots of robot components into a big pot. We stirred it. We threw in some evolution that took these pieces and combined them together, joints and bars and neurons of neural networks and motors, and connected them in random ways, and then tested them for their ability to move, to crawl across an infinite plane, and then took those robots that did better than others and reproduced them with slight variations, and kept on doing that for thousands of generations. So it took about a week on a parallel computer back in 2000. Today, you can probably run this on your cell phone. And we got these kind of interesting machines that crawl across the plane. Here are two of these machines crawling across the floor of the lab later on. We used 3D printing, rapid prototyping to print these machines layer by layer. It was a relatively new technology at the time, and here they are, two of these machines crawling across the floor. So these are, this is one of our earliest works in trying to make robots that are adaptive and aren't designed explicitly to do something. Here's a close-up of one of these machines. And so this is one of these robots, and this is after finishing this in my postdoc, I went ahead and got a faculty position based on this thing, but it was a faculty position in mechanical engineering. And as people in mechanical engineering will tell you, you can't get tenure by making plastic robots in mechanical engineering. They have to be made of titanium. So we made some, this is actually aluminum robots, but it looks like titanium. And we built this robot that's a lot more complicated. And the question was, can we use the same evolutionary techniques to make a robot like this actually behave in a way that's interesting and something that conventional control theory people can't derive using conventional techniques. So this is an interesting robot. It's a very powerful robot. It has 12 pneumatic actuators. It has a high-pressure paintball canister in the center. It has all these valves in the front. And you turn these valves on and off, and this thing contorts, and it... Did I say something wrong? So, what happens now? Okay. יש מקומות מקדימה, אתם רוצים לשבת. Okay, so we built this robot. It has it's very powerful. It can jump up in the air and can do a lot of interesting things here. But the challenge is to make it actually to see if these machine learning algorithms can actually make it exploit these things. So we put this robot in a cage. There's a camera that can see this robot over here. This is the camera view. It can actually see this red dot on the robot. And then we evolve controllers that make this robot jump, move forward in interesting ways. So we start off with random controllers that turn on the valves on and off in a kind of random way. And then controllers that do better than others get to reproduce with other controllers, and we get better and better controllers over time. So that's the idea. It's completely automatic, except for, see, under the stage here, there's a graduate student who comes out once in a while and pulls the robot out of the corner when it gets stuck. But apart from that, it's fairly automatic, and it keeps on going back and forth. And we leave it overnight, and we see what happens. So long story short, here's one of these robots, and it's supposed to play. So again, not playing. Right, so the long story short is, well, this I play this, so let me see. Okay, so this robot learned how to walk in an interesting way. It kind of jumps around and does its thing, but it didn't quite learn how to jump up in the air and do kind of loop-de-loops and things that it can actually do in terms of its power. So it's a fairly simple robot, but the algorithm didn't work very well. It kind of learned to move and crawl around, but didn't quite get to where we wanted to get. So I've shown you two projects, and the idea here is very simple. The first project, we did the entire learning in simulation, and then we built the best robot that we have. We tried it out in reality, and we crossed our fingers, and it worked in reality, but only because the robots were very simple. And in fact, this kind of approach in general doesn't scale to more complex situations when the dynamics are complex. If you know, the more complex the dynamics, the less likely it is that what works in simulation will also transfer into reality, and something we call the simulation reality gap. And any robotics engineer will know that this gap is difficult to cross the more complex and sophisticated the robot is. In the second project, there was no simulation at all. It was all a physical robot. But in that robot, the challenge was that it took too many trials on the physical robot. So there's a limit to how many trials we can do in a physical robot overnight, maybe 1,000. It wears out the robot. It takes a lot of energy and time. It doesn't scale either. So we stuck between these two approaches. Either we do everything in simulation, but we have the reality gap, or we do things in physical reality, but it takes too many physical trials. What can we do? There must be a different approach. So the third approach, and I hope you'll see the connection to the robotic scientist, is a kind of a hybrid idea. And the idea is very simple. We start off with a simulator. I'm putting a simulator in quotes because it's not going to be a good simulator. It's actually going to be an inaccurate simulator. We use the best simulator we have. We evolve robots. And then we take the best robot that we get. We try it in reality. Now, because the simulator wasn't very good, the robot that we get isn't going to be very good either. Nevertheless, we collect sensory information from that robot. So we have actions and sensations, motor commands, and sensor readings. For example, motor torques and accelerations that the robot feels. And from that input and output relationship, we can now evolve better simulators, right? So beforehand, we were only evolving robots given a physics simulator. Now we're evolving also the physics retrospectively based on the experiences of the robot. We get better and better simulators. We then take the best simulator that we have. We use it to evolve a better robot. We take the best robot that we have, we try it in reality, it's still not going to work, but it's only our second physical trial. We get more data, we now have an even better data set, we evolve even better simulators and so forth. So in other words, we have a co-evolution, if you like, of two things. We have robots and simulators co-evolving at the same time, and they have a kind of somewhat antagonistic relationship, but somewhat cooperative, right? It's a little bit like a predator-prey, maybe professor-student kind of relationship, right? Kind of leading, competing, but somehow, hopefully, climbing up the ladder of complexity. So let me show you how that works. Here's a third robot. This is the robot that was on the cover slide. This is a four-legged machine. As you can see, it has 8 motors, one at the hip and one at the knee of every leg. And also it has 2 tilt sensors that tell it how it's tilted left and right, forward and backwards. So now this robot needs to learn how to walk. But the catch is that this robot has no clue what it looks like. It doesn't know if it's a snake, if it's a spider, if it's a tree. It doesn't know how these 8 motors are connected, where and how. So the question is, how can this robot learn how to walk? So now to understand what that means, imagine yourself for a moment sitting in a black box with no windows, and all you have are 8 knobs. And as you turn these 8 knobs, the box tilts left and right, forward and backwards, and you have to find a way to move forward. Now the question is there a way to do that that's kind of beyond trial and error? Is there a way to actually do this kind of self-modeling? So what we're going to do is the robot is going to start off by making a random motion, randomly actuate the motor. It's then going to start creating self-models, self-simulations. And you'll see this in a movie in a moment, and you'll see that all the models it's created of itself are wrong. But you'll know they're wrong only because you happen to know what the robot really looks like. But insofar as the robot knows, these are all going to be models that are compatible with its brief experience. The next step, and this is in the green box, and this is the critical step, it will look for the action, the motor command, that causes the most disagreement between predictions of these models. Why the most disagreement? It's like a scientist designing an experiment that causes the most disagreement between predictions of competing theories, because then the result from that experiment will refute at least one of those theories. So we'll look for the action that causes the most variance in predictions of good models here, then go back, try that action that causes the most disagreement, get more data, refute some of the models, improve others, and continue in this cycle, doing relatively few experiments, a lot of computation, until it can eventually narrow down all the models to the point where they are kind of converged and they agree. So we have this kind of active learning process. At this point, it goes over here, and it takes the best model that it has, it tries to find out a way to move forward using that model. And because the model is pretty close to reality, what makes the model move forward will also make the robot move forward as well. And my videos are not working, and this is going to be very bad.
Maybe you can operate them outside the presentation?
This has not happened before, so I'm not sure. Okay, there you go. So this is one of our first trials of getting the algorithm to work. You know, if you're working in robotics, you never know if it's the last time the robot's going to work, so the camera is always rolling. And here, unplugged itself and died. So that was that. So the robot was kind of inferring what it is, and that didn't quite work. But we tamed it down a little bit. And here's one of the successful runs. So this is its first interaction, brief motion. Here, all the self-models is created. Now, as you can see, they're all wrong, but they all cause the green box to tilt in the same way. So insofar as the robot knows, these are valid hypotheses about what it might be. This is the 8th out of 16 brief trials with the world. It's beginning to figure out it has 4 legs, doesn't quite know where and how they're connected, but it's beginning to kind of get the idea. And this is the 16 out of 16 trials, and pretty much figured out that it has 4 legs. The positions aren't quite right, but it's close enough to reality. Then it uses that self-image that it created to find a way to move forward. And here it is, kind of crawling around. And you know, frankly, we were hoping to get an evil spidery walk emerge out of this, but instead, we got this lame way of moving forward. But when you look at this robot, you have to remember it was not programmed to walk. It did not have a model of itself to begin with, nor did it do trials of walking before this. It had the basic components, a goal, and it created this model.
Is there a reward function with these programming?
So the reward function for the first step is to make models disagree in their predictions, and the reward for the second is to move the farthest. In this case, yeah, that's built in. So the first you can think of as kind of curiosity, a self-modeling phase, and the second one is goal-oriented. Okay, so just to test this, we did something very cruel. We chopped off a leg of the robot, and within about a day, the robot's self-image also loses a leg. So it doesn't quite lose it, just makes it very short. I don't know if you can see here this stub here. It still needs to place the borders in some places, but then it has a new self-image. It takes about a day, and then it figures out how to move with that leg. I know it's very sad, but we put the leg back on again. But the point here is, again, you can probably find a better way to make this robot move without a leg. But the point is that there wasn't a sensor that said leg came off, switch to plan B. Instead, the leg came off, the dynamics changed, the self-image changed, and therefore the behavior changed. So we're after adaptation, and that's an example of that. All right, so these are 13 dependent runs, just to show you some statistics. The red dots are where the robot ends up if it starts, if it has a random controller. The blue dots are where it actually goes to with its physical trials, and the black dots are where it thinks it's going to get to using its self-image. So just like anything else in academia, this robot has an inflated self-image. It thinks it can go farther than it really can, but nevertheless, even though that self-image is wrong, it allows it to make the right decision. So it's an interesting kind of property. In fact, I gave a talk about this in social science conference. People were interested to know about whether it's better to have an inflated self-image or deflated self-image in various situations, and it's interesting to be able to look at that from a different perspective. Another project that we're doing now, which I'm not going to talk about, is a robot modeling another robot just by looking at that robot, creating models of its structure and models of its controller simply by observation. And that's the beginning of theory of mind, something humans do a lot, and animals as well, but robots at this point don't. So that's a whole different direction, but what I really want to talk about now is taking this idea and moving it into arbitrary dynamical systems. So we did this project, we published it, but then came a new student and said, let's take that algorithm, pluck it out of the robot, and instead of a robot, this algorithm making a model of the robot, let's make it model other things. Anything it can control, it might be able to model. So you can think of a black box system where you have some inputs, some things you can control, you have some outputs which you can observe, and based on the input and output, you want to create a model of what's going on in the black box. Arguably, that's all of science. But what's interesting here is that you can control the inputs in order to extract useful information out of the box. So you can interrogate the box, in other words, to get the information you need. So what I'm going to do is, this is a slide I showed you before. I just replaced the picture of the robot with some experimental system. Instead of motor commands, I have some knobs in the experiment that I can control. The heat, the temperature, the mixing rate, whatever it is. This is a biology experiment. I can control concentrations of nutrients. There's some things I can measure in the output. And I am going to take that input-output and evolve models. Instead of evolving robot structures, I'm going to evolve models. Instead of being made of robot components, they're going to be made of components of some other language, for example, mathematics. Right? So I'm going to create models out of pieces of equations and variables, literally plus, minus, divide, multiply, open brackets, close brackets. You can create lots of these models to match up with the data. And then the important step is evolve the next set of experiments that cause these models to disagree in their prediction. Take the best experiment, perform it on the experimental system, get more data, refute some of the models, improve others, and so forth. So we'll go in this cycle, just like I did before, but on an arbitrary experimental system. So that's the basic idea. And I have to say that in this big loop, we occasionally need to do a real experiment to get some data. Be done by a human in service of the automated scientist. It could be done by another robot that actually does physical experiments based on what this algorithm tells it to do, or what most people prefer to do, and it can be done in many cases, is to do lots of random experiments, put them in a big database, and then when the algorithm needs a experiment, it looks up the closest experiment in the database, pulls that out, and uses it. All right, so I'm going to say automatic experimentation, but you can replace that with a human, with a robot, or with a big database. All right, so how does this work? So first I want to show an example, an application. We did this. This is one of our first experiments. We did this on this bridge. This is a bridge I cross into Cornell every morning when I walk to work. And when you cross this bridge, you have a long time to think what would happen if something here wasn't as strong as it needs to be. And so we applied it to this bridge. So what we did is we put small vibrators on the bridge. This is on simulation. We didn't do it on the real bridge. Vibrated subtly here and there, and then sense vibrations in other locations. And from the relationship between actuation and sensation, the bridge creates models, then see how to disambiguate these models by vibrating in different ways. And you can find a weak element a lot faster and more accurately than traditional civil engineering approaches for structural identification. So that's an example of application to a bridge, which you might think is a very static kind of problem. But I want to show you how this works on a kind of mathematical modeling. So to explain mathematical modeling, I have to first say a couple of words on this idea called symbolic regression. So I'm sure you're all familiar with regression methods, right? So you have a mathematical equation, you have some coefficients, and you fit the coefficients to the data based on, by optimizing the coefficients based on data that you have. And there's numerous algorithms to do that: linear regression, nonlinear regression, lots of ways to do that. The idea of symbolic regression is that when you don't even know what the model is, right? So let me give you an example. Here's some data. What mathematical model do you think, what equation generated this data? It's not a rhetoric question. Perfect.
Any prior assumption?
But you got it right. That was very fast. Exponent times sine. And if you're trying to do this in your head, you were doing symbolic regression. You did not care about the coefficients, but you took the basic building blocks that you're familiar with, trigonometric functions, exponents, and so forth, and try to do this kind of qualitative fitting. So this is what we call symbolic regression, and this has been around for 2 or 3 decades already, since the early 90s. And the idea was very simple. You evolve expressions, mathematical expressions, in the form of parsed trees. This is a tree that describes the function x1 minus 3 times sine of x2 plus minus 7. So it's a function. We evolve these recombined trees starting from scratch. We have data, and we gradually, over time, will get better and better expression to explain the data. So that's an idea that's been around for a long time, but it turns out nobody really used it. And why didn't people use it? For the main two curses of machine learning. First, it takes a long time to run. It takes a lot of computational power because you have to try out lots of expressions against a lot of data. So it's very computationally intensive. And then it gets stuck in local optima, it bloats, it overfits the data, the usual stuff. So what we did is exactly the same thing, but with one tiny twist, which makes a big difference. We evolved models to fit the data, but we don't match these models against the entire data set, only at a few data points. And these data points are also evolving at the same time, and their fitness is to what degree they can make these models disagree in their predictions. So the moment a data point is explained by most of the models, it is no longer used. So what happens is that you might have a gigabyte of data, but you only need maybe 8 points to rank your models, and these 8 points, they are moving around all the time depending on what models you have. Okay, so you get two things. it works faster and also alleviates a lot of the overfitting. So here's an example. This is on inferring this function that I just showed you. If you use the entire data, you go up to here. If you use the co-evolved data set, you find solutions faster and more accurately than using the entire data set. This is a little bit counterintuitive that fewer points are more useful than the entire data set, but it has to be these special points. This is the performance of randomly sampled points. In case you're thinking it's just the subsampling that's doing it, that's not it. It really has to be co-evolved to defeat the models, all right? So it's a little bit of this predator-prey relationship that we discussed before. Here's the size of the good solutions. If you use the entire data set, you usually get larger solutions than you get if you use just the subset, again, for the same level of accuracy, okay? So you get solutions faster and more accurately. All right, so we have this thing in hand. Now the question is, what do we do with it? So the first thing we tried is to predict the stock market. We spent quite a while trying to do that, and it didn't work, which is why I'm still here. And but it did work for other people. I can tell you later how, although it's difficult to find out. But seeing that we're not going to get rich, we thought, okay, let's take the prime numbers and see if we can fit an equation to the prime numbers. We tried that also. We were not successful in that either, although we did find some well-known approximations. So, so seeing that we're not going to get rich or famous, we said, okay, let's write some grant proposals and see how far we can go. So we published this technique, and we immediately got an email from CERN, Particle Accelerator, and they said, we have a perfect problem for you. We have some gap between energy and mass. I don't exactly understand. Maybe you can find this relationship and explain that gap. So we punch in the numbers, we hit enter, and we get this equation that explains the gap to 3 digits. So we're very excited. We send it back. We're already thinking about flights to Stockholm and all that. But then they immediately sent back an email and said, we already know about this formula. It's called the Weizsäcker's formula, and our formula is good for 4 numbers. So they were disappointed, but we were actually very excited because it means that our algorithm can find named formula, right? It means that maybe it can find some new things that we don't know yet. But the really exciting thing is to take it from just fitting data to actually making dynamical models, models that predict dynamics. So it's very easy. Instead of taking just data, you take time series, you compute the derivative of the time series, and then you fit the models to derivatives, and then you get a dynamical model. So that's, of course, easier said than done because there's noise and all that. But let's say you can do that well. You can take a bunch of data and find differential equations that fit the data. Here's an example. These are 7 differential equations that describe the glycolysis cycle in the cell. I don't understand what that means exactly, but these are difficult equations. We took them from a paper. We generated data. We added 10% noise. We fed it back into the algorithm, and within about 4 hours, we got these 7 differential equations back. And again, this is without, we don't know the form of the equation, right? So we just put in the data, we get these several differential equations, including these nonlinearities and everything, and only this term here was wrong, but it's fairly small. So we have this thing here, and the question is, what can we do with it? And of course, you can take these equations and create these maps almost automatically, so it's a very useful tool for biologists. So to give you an idea of how this compares to state of the art, here's another example. This is actually fairly recent. This is a student who made a flapping hovering machine that flaps its wings and hovers in place a bit like a mosquito. It's very difficult to make. He designed it. It's almost 90% printed. And part of the challenge here is to understand wing dynamics, aeroelastic behavior of wings. So now people spend careers trying to model these things. But we said, okay, let's just take this, capture a video of this thing with a high-speed camera, feed it into this algorithm, and see what kind of dynamical model it's going to create to predict the lift out of all these measurements. So we put that in, and we got some interesting equations, but I won't show you the equations themselves. But what I want to do is compare those equations to the state of the art. So I'm going to compare models generated by this to the state of the art on 2 axes, on complexity and on accuracy. So generally speaking, you have lots of models for phenomena. Some of them can be more complex and more accurate, and some of them can be less complex but also less accurate. And there's a trade-off, and usually there's room for lots of different models at different levels of complexity and accuracy. So each dot here is somebody's career trying to model this. And you have lots of different kind of models and so forth. So when we ran this on this algorithm, in about a day, it kind of rediscovered many of these dynamical systems. And the next day, it discovered a few models here, which are both simpler and more accurate than state of the art. And this is what polynomial fits do at various degrees if you just want to have a reference. So that's just an idea of how that works. So, but I gave this talk somewhere, and I kind of ended at this point, and I said, I have a hammer. I'm looking for nails. I can model things. If you have data, give me your data. We'll create a model. We can publish a paper together. And usually it ends there, and people don't give me their data. But one guy, Gul Sul from the University of Texas Southwestern, came to me and said, I have the perfect data for you. I'm studying Bacillus subtilis, a certain type of bacteria. I have single cell dynamics, and maybe you can model these. Now, most biologists will measure dynamics on a vat of 1 billion cells, and all the interesting dynamics are averaged out. But this guy measures dynamics of single cells. So he has 60 cells. He can measure what's going on inside the cell, and he has the 60 time traces for individual cells. And he says, I'll give you the data. You give me the equation that describes the dynamics of all these cells, possibly with different parameters for different cells, but the same form of the equation for the entire data set. So he gives me that, and we plug in the data. We hit enter. We wait for a week, and we get these equations here at the top. So I don't know if these equations are right or wrong. I send them to Google. They kind of fit the data, but I don't know. And he immediately says, it's total crap. These equations don't mean anything. They're not biological. It's not working. So we're very depressed at this point. We didn't know what to do. We thought, okay, we must be doing something wrong. We must not be using the right building blocks. And it's true, we gave it sine and cosine, which is a physics thing, and biology doesn't have sine and cosine, so that's a relevant building block, but we're missing some building block that's relevant to biology. And we thought about it a lot, and then we came up with this idea of a building block called time delays. So time delays are very important in biology because of diffusion and so forth. So we added a time delay building block. We hit enter, and bam, we got these two equations that explain the entire data set. And I send these equations to Gro, and he immediately sends me back an email and he says, we have a problem. These are the equations we published in Science, and your equations are simpler. They are, in fact, just as accurate, sometimes more accurate. Our equations are symmetric. These aren't. So I don't understand either of these equations, but as far as I know, this must be closer to the truth. The only problem is that we have no clue what they mean. In fact, I thought of giving this as a final exam to my students to prove that these two are the same equations. But they're not. So there's something in here which we don't yet understand. In fact, we haven't published this yet because a lot of editors came back and said, if you don't understand it, we're not going to publish it. But that's exactly the point. So it fits the data perfectly, including unseen data sets, new strands of these bacteria, and so forth. So it must be right in some way. It must be holding something, but we don't understand what it means. So that brings me to this question of meaning. And we want to move beyond data mining and fitting to actually getting to understand the meaning. And the best example of this difference between data mining and finding meaning is this famous example. This is, I didn't make this up. If you people analyze the data from a supermarket and found out that people that buy diapers on Thursday evenings also buy beer. And if you run a supermarket, you don't care why. You just move the beer next to the diapers and you sell more. But if you're a scientist, you often care why. You want to know what is the reason behind these correlations and the causality. So a good example of understanding the why is this idea of an invariant. So what's an invariant? Here's a pendulum. Imagine a pendulum swinging back and forth. You have angle and angular velocity over time, two variables, angle and angular velocity. And you ask, what is not changing about the angle and angular velocity? Right, so is the ratio constant? No. Is there some constant? No. What's not changing about angle and angular velocity? What? What? Nope. You have two there's no vectors, these are scalars. Energy, right? Perfect. So the energy, the particular formula that describes the potential energy plus the kinetic energy of this pendulum is more or less invariant, is conserved during the motion. Now, the energy function of the pendulum, what is known as the Hamiltonian of the pendulum, it tells you everything you want to know about the pendulum. Its dynamics, its chaos, everything is in there. So now the question is, can we find, given a dynamical system, what is not changing about it? What is conserved about it? So that's really will help us get to the meaning. So the nice thing about evolutionary algorithms is that it's really easy to change the goal. So whereas before we were evolving equations to fit the derivatives, now we're going to evolve equations that are roughly conserved across an entire data set. So we change the fitness criteria, we hit enter, we wait for a week, finally the screen blinks, we gather around, and the answer comes out. 42. And if you think about it, it's true. This is a function that is in fact exactly constant across the entire data set. The only problem is that it doesn't use the actual variables. So we actually got other constants as well, as you can imagine. Lots of solutions. So a student in the corner of the lab says, I know what to do. All you have to do is penalize the system for not using variables. So push it away from just finding trivial constants. So we add that in. It's a fairly easy hack. We hit enter again. We wait for a week, and we get this. This is true. It's a function. It's conserved across the entire data set, but it's not what we wanted. So another student comes in and says, I have this library that can eliminate trivialities symbolically. He codes that in. The code runs 100 times more slowly, but we still run it. We wait for a week again, and we get this answer. It's a little bit more sophisticated. This is as close to a constant as you want. You can't factor it out. It's still useless. I guess it's like arguing with a teenager. You get what you asked for, but it's not what you wanted. So what do we do? So I give it as homework in my class. And one student, Michael Schmidt, comes back and says, I know exactly what to do. All you have to do is take the derivatives of the data, compute dx dy, dy dx. You can have a candidate function f. You can symbolically compute df dx, df dy. The ratio between them will also give you the predicted dx dy. You compare these, and the system cannot cheat. It has to give you a true invariant. And he hands in the 3 homework questions with the exact invariant for these clean data sets. So with that in hand, we start running it on some real systems. This is one of our first systems. It's a Physics 101 air cart. We collect that. There's a red sticker on it. There's a webcam watching the sticker, collects the data, what is not changing, and we get the Hamiltonian of an oscillator. We also get the Lagrangian, which is not an invariant, but this formulation also gives you Lagrangians. We run it on a pendulum. This is a pendulum. It's swinging back and forth. We get the Hamiltonian of a pendulum within a few minutes. We kicked it up a notch, and this is a double oscillator with two carts and 3 springs. And you ask, what is not changing about the green and the red curve here? This is not changing, and this is indeed the Hamiltonian of a double oscillator. And then we run it again on a double pendulum. This is Steve Strogatz releasing a double pendulum. A webcam is watching this, thinks about this for a day with 32 cores, and comes back with all these different things. This is the Hamiltonian of a double pendulum. This is conservation of momentum, which is true of the high energy swings. There's F equal ma, all kinds of invariants in the system. It all came out from this single run. So I showed you 2 examples. One when we found invariants in mechanical systems. The other one when we found ordinary differential equation sets in biological systems. Of course, the question is, can we find invariants in biological systems? We can. We find some very interesting invariants, but we don't know what they mean. And we can't publish it for the same reason. So we have this kind of oracle that tells us what's going on, but we don't know what's happening. So at this point, we published the paper. And we started getting a lot of emails. And all the emails said exactly the same thing. They said, I have data. I need to graduate. Please find something in my data. And we became the bottleneck of graduation of a lot of people. And so we released the software. It's called Eureka with a Q, misspelled with a Q, so you can find it easily, Q for equation. It looks like a spreadsheet. You paste your data, let's say 3 columns, and you label the columns with some variable names, like say X, Y, and Z. And then you can issue queries on the data. Like, let's say you can look for a function Z as a function of X and Y. You give it building blocks, and it will search for a function that expresses that. You can look for an invariant. You can look for a differential equation. You have to say what you're looking for, and it will give you a result in this form, a handful of equations of different complexity on this Pareto front of complexity versus accuracy. And often the equation that is useful is somewhere in the middle here, right? Increasingly, however, people don't even want to put in the queries. All they want is one button. And so we've actually put that in now. So you put in the data and you hit one button and you wait for a day, and it will tell you everything there is to know about your data set. This has led to a lot of work. There's right now 30,000 people using the software in various ways. Most of them, we don't know what they're using them. I think half of them are using it to predict the stock market. Others are using it for big science and small science. This is someone using it for radon detection, for creating models that are fast approximation for strengths of welds in order to circumvent things. Some people are using it to take an equation and produce data and then regress it and get a simple approximation. Somebody else has been using it to improve the accuracy of particle acceleration detection has been improved 5-fold by using Eureka. Other people are using it for decision and classification. You can even, because you have control of the building blocks, you can replace one of the building blocks, let's say, with noise and predict distribution. So you can make stochastic models. Recently, we've also been doing work on creating models that are reaction models rather than differential equations. This is very useful for chemists and biologists. They like models of this form, and so forth. So there's a lot of interesting applications. The last thing I want to say is that you can take this kind of relationship between the data and the equations, and you can think about these equations as the genome of your data set. So you have a gigabyte of data, and that gigabyte of data is represented by these equations at different levels of accuracy. So you can represent that data using these small set of equations like a DNA sort of thing. Once you have that thing, you can take another data set and compare it to. So we crawl the internet now. We look for all the data sets that we can find. We compute the genomes, and we find relationship between them. So we get these interesting clusters, which means that all the data on the internet that we could find clusters into these interesting relationships. Here we have all the linear systems, oscillating systems, nonlinear, rationals, all kinds of interesting kind of a map of all the different data sets that we can find. Here's a lot of random systems, which are probably not random. They're just too complicated for us to model. Now you can enter your data set into the system, and it will tell you where you are on this map. Hopefully you're not in this area. That's the bad news. But if you're in this area, you might say, okay, who's next to me? Maybe it's somebody that stole your data, but maybe it's somebody who's working on a different problem that has very similar characteristics, and you should get in touch with them. So this is like dating for scientists. All right. So we have here, so to conclude, we know that that evolution can't write Shakespeare, but it's interesting that it can find Hamiltonians, that they're evolvable at all, and where is this all leading to? So Chris Anderson, editor of Wired magazine, said in a famous article, The End of Science, correlation is enough. Faced with massive data, scientific method is becoming obsolete. We can stop looking for models. But I beg to disagree with that. In fact, more data allows us to create better models more accurately and faster than ever before. And I think that's going to accelerate science, actually. New York Times said about this work that I showed you, theoretical physicists are not yet obsolete, but scientists have taken steps towards replacing themselves. And that's actually not true as well. I was very careful to show you that we are still needed to decide which variables to use, which building blocks to use, and when we use the wrong building blocks, we get garbage. and finally to assign meaning to the result, which we still don't know how to do. Thank you.
Time for questions.
Yep. Well, you can use it to predict probabilistic distributions, but you don't use any probabilistic distributions in the deterministic models. When you go to predict, when we in the version that's not Eureka, it's something in the lab that makes stochastic models, we compare predictions, we compare distributions. Yeah.
If you take data on a finite interval, you can always fit a higher order polynomial as accurately as you want.
Right.
So the reason that you have this mixture of exponential and sine and so on and so forth is hidden in the algorithm in which you fit the symbolic expression.
That's right.
Correct?
Yeah.
So with the different algorithm, you get different equations.
Right. So it's important to emphasize that this algorithm doesn't yield one solution. It yields a handful of solutions at different complexities and different accuracies. So you can choose between which one you want. But what's particularly interesting that usually we do not get, even though it's possible to get polynomials of high order to fit the data, these usually don't come out because if there is a simpler equation, a simpler form that fits the data just as well, but is simpler, those equations tend to take over. And so what happens is that in the beginning, if you stop it within 5 seconds, you will see a lot of polynomials. But if there's a better explanation, that will kind of rise up to the top because of this AIC criteria of complexity versus accuracy.
The notion of simpler is built in.
It's not built in. It's built in through the idea of coevolution. So what happens is you have equations that are more complex, that overfit the data, that tend to disagree in their predictions, and the next data point will refute these. So indirectly, it's built in that way. Yeah.
When you mentioned the delay, I failed to identify in your equations the delay.
Oh, okay. So I didn't show it there, but the expression when there was, let's say, k was the variable, it had a subscript, and that means k at a certain time interval in the past. But both the simple equations and the established equations both had delays in them. But it was just a subscript there. Yeah.
Going back to this issue of simplicity, in machine learning there's a very well-defined notion of simplicity for something like BC dimension or something like that, which depends explicitly on the type of problem you're looking at now. Here, I mean, if you're comparing polynomials, exponentials, trigonometric, or anything, I mean, the notion of simplicity is not inherent, as you said, in this. So is there a way to think of developing a theory for understanding what kind of simplicity emerges from this structure?
That's an excellent question, and I don't know the answer. I think, so again, we have this idea of competition between models, and simpler models that are not too simple tend to not disagree in their predictions, but like you said, there are 50 ways to do it, and it's problem dependent. And so I don't know the answer. What do you mean diagonalize operators?
For example, you're using some simulation, you have prediction data, but you want to know what is the eigenfunctions of the operator.
So we don't have any eigenfunctions or anything here like that. So there's no vector operations here. This is data, just data, and we fit in equations to it. Now you could say maybe referring to normalizing the data, doing PCA, things like that. Is that what you're referring to? No. So there's no. So the answer is no. We don't do that. And if you can see a way to do that, that will help. I'd be happy to hear. Yeah.
You didn't make much about the underlying algorithm. Can you tell us the standard genetic algorithms? What is the population, mutations?
So, okay, so there's a lot of details which most people aren't interested in, but it's all published in papers. The basic idea is, so we use multi-objective optimization to do this. So population size varies with time depending on Pareto optimization, it's a genetic program that evolves these trees. These are the expressions trees. It is coevolution, so we have the points and the things co-evolving at the same time. And the multi-objective is usually the error, which is trying to be reduced, and the age of the individuals, which means that if you have two solutions, one, they both are just as accurate, but one of them is younger. The younger one is better because it has more growth potential, and we use that to maintain diversity. But there's a lot of details. It's definitely not a conventional fixed population GA.
I have a paper collection of work in the 1980s at IBM on something called minimum description length as a measure of complexity of that. I don't remember enough.
No, that's so people spend a lot of careers trying to on this question of complexity versus accuracy and how you measure complexity, and it depends on the building block. For example, if I have sine and cosine, it's a complex building block. So there's no simple answer. And so again, we bypass this thing because we don't have an explicit measure. We just let solutions compete, and when they disagree in their prediction, the point goes there, and that tends to eliminate overfit equations. So we don't have a penalty for that. But in terms of ranking complexity on the Pareto chart, we just count the number of operators in the equation and free parameter. But there's 50 ways to do it. I'll take this question first.
So in Eureka you have these tuples that you bring in.
Yeah.
But what about completely independent sequences such as Fourier transform of a signal and its transform? And I don't know how to put them into Eureka in order for Eureka to derive the Fourier transform.
Okay, I have to understand more about that problem to think about how to do it. But you definitely can put separate sequences and separate them. And like we did with the biology, where we had multiple data sets and we're looking for one model that explains the data sets, even though they are different with different parameters. But I don't think that's what you mean.
Have you been able to derive a Fourier transform from a signal and its transform given?
I don't think we have. I haven't tried that. But like I said, there are 30,000 people using it, and probably somebody did. We don't know what they do except when it doesn't work. Yeah.
There's a lot of work moving here on compressive sensing, which basically says that you have a signal with some kind of something about it that can sample it more efficiently than straightforward.
Right.
Now I'm wondering whether this would, given a signal and kind of data, applying this to somehow find those characteristics,
Yeah.
would help to decide what basis.
Exactly. I think that absolutely right. There's a connection to compressive sensing. In fact, if you look at where these, let's say, 8 points jump around, and you actually track that, they will tend to lock on the features that are important in the signal. So that's kind of compressive sensing, and that's a very interesting relationship. Absolutely. Yeah, you'll stop me when I'm out of time. Okay, I'll just keep going.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
Number one, in any fitting problem, there's a balance between the fit and the complexity, and where you choose that trade-off affects the solution.
Right.
So I want to know how is that you handle that and how is that affected?
We sidestepped the entire problem by just showing you a bunch of solutions at different complexities. So that's such a big problem that we leave it to the user. Okay, so the algorithm will show you at the end a bunch of solutions, more complex and more accurate, less complex and less accurate, maybe a handful, 10 different solutions, and you can look at these, and usually that requires some domain knowledge to know what's the right balance. Although you can use criteria like AIC and some established methods to kind of rank them, but that's with a grain of salt.
And number two, very related, is that it seems such a non-linear parameter space to navigate. So you probably have to run with many times with many different conditions.
Yes, except that this algorithm that we have actually continuously feeds in new initial conditions. So it's like so it's continuously doing it. It's not exactly random restart, but it's a continuous process. So it effectively does that.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much, Hod.
Thank you.
Two questions. Are you related to Stiglitz?
כן, בן שלו.
אתה הבן שלו?
כן.
גם לליפסון את ליפסון.
כן?
יעקב קצרל. נעים
מאוד.
אני מדבר איתו בפעם.
אוקיי? כן.
הדבר השני, שעשיתי דוקטורט, אני גמרתי דוקטורט עד 50 שנה, ב-MIT,
כן.
רציתי לעבוד על בקרה במחשבים. אז המדריך שלי לא ידע על זה שום דבר. והלכתי לשמוע הרצאה במינסקי, שהיו לו עדיין שערות, ומקארתי